Good day, everyone. Today we're going to talk about our next topic, which is functions for all subtasks. So, if you will remember from the previous chapter, we've already talked about the introduction of functions. So, in that chapter, we were able to discuss what functions are. So, specifically, we got introduced to built-in functions or predefined functions in C++, as well as we've already learned how to create our own functions called uh, user-defined functions. So if you will recall, we were also able to learn how to overload functions. So from there, we were able to use overloaded functions, as well as also learned how to use parameters and how to use them whenever a function is called. So to continue from that topic, we will now talk about more of functions. So specifically, this chapter is divided in the following subtopics. So first, we shall start with void functions. So talking about void functions, of course, in top-down design, a subtask, or shall we say a function, might produce no value, one value, or more than one value. So what we're trying to say here is, of course, there are functions in C++ that actually return a value after its execution, although there are also functions that are actually not required to return a value. So that will be in the case of utility functions. And also we have seen how to implement functions that return one value. So from the previous chapter, we've already seen examples on how to do that. So in the case of void functions, of course, a void function implements a subtask that returns no value, or it could also be a function which returns more than one value, as opposed from our previous examples, which return only a single value. Now, so there are two main differences between void function definitions and the definitions of functions that return one value. So take note of this keyword. Okay, so we have the keyword void. So if we will recall from the previous chapter, of course, it's always a part of a function signature. So for example, whenever you declare a function, so you will have to provide its signature, which is comprised of its return type, function name, its parameter list. Okay? So actually, in the case of void function, pareho lang ina siya. No? But of course, as you can see here, this time, the return type for our function signature is instead the keyword void. So it means that such function returns no value. Okay? So we have here an example, just like this one. Okay? So this is the syntax for avoid functions. If you will look closer, actually it's still the same, no, as the functions that we have previously discussed in the last chapter. So it has its declaration, okay, and it also has the same syntax for the function signature, and of course it also has the same syntax for the function definition. Only that, of course, as you can see here, okay, it has no return type, hence the keyword void. So how do we use a void function? Okay, so void functions are called executable statements. So what do we mean by that? It means they do not need to be a part of another statement. So if we will recall, when we use functions that actually return a value, so we usually call them as a part of another statement, such as this one. But as opposed to a void function, of course, we don't do that because, as we have mentioned, these are actually executable statements. So therefore, we can call them this way. Okay, so we just provide the function name, and of course, we provide the required arguments, okay, which will provide the value for the formal parameters. So more on void function calls. So the mechanism is nearly the same as the function calls that we have seen, as I've mentioned a while ago. So argument values are substituted for the formal parameters. So of course, if an argument is expected, so you should also provide that whenever you call such function, and in which statements in function body are executed. And of course, there's also an optional return statement which ends the function. So again, looking back from our previous lesson, of course, functions that return a single value, since they have a return type, of course, they have the required return statement in the end of its execution. In the case of void function calls, that is optional. So what do we mean by that? So it means that it's okay not to include a return statement to end our function, because in the first place, its return type is void. But of course, later on, we will see some examples why it is still useful to include a return statement to end a void function. So here's an example. Okay. So for this example, we have here a function which can be used to convert Fahrenheit temperatures to Celsius using the formula. So I guess this formula is quite familiar to all of us. So let's see the example using our dev C++ compiler. Okay, so here it is. So here's our example. So as you can see here, okay, we have the following functions. Okay, of course, we have here the function declarations. Okay, so we have here a couple of functions, and in which two of them are actually void functions. Okay, so we have here two functions which does not return a value, and another one which of course returns a double data type value. Okay, and here's our main function. Okay, and as you can see here, okay, looking back at our void functions, okay, the initialize screen and the show results. So let's take a look on how they are called in our main function. So as we have mentioned a while ago, so this is actually an example of how void functions are called. As you can see here, they are actually called as executable statements. Okay, the initialize screen as well as the show results. Okay, so they are called as an executable statement, as opposed with the other function, which is Celsius. As you can see here, okay, it is called as a part of another statement. Okay, so that's an obvious difference between the two, no? The way they are called. And let's take a closer look at the function definition. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. So as you can see here, actually this is just a utility function. Okay, and as you can see here, it has a return statement. In the case of the Celsius function, of course, since it has a double return type, so it only makes sense that it must also have this return statement, which of course returns the value resulting from this statement. And another example here, the show results function, which is of course a void function. These are the routine which the function does, and of course, as you can see here, there's a return statement. Now, if we are going to run this, this is how it will look like. Okay, we're going to run this one. So here, so for example, I'm going to provide 55.5. Okay, so that's the output. Okay, our input in Fahrenheit has been converted to degrees Celsius. So anyway, that's just an example. So let's get back to our slides. Now, going back to the question. So talking about void functions, as we have seen, they're not returning any value. So why use the return statement? Okay, so the question is a return statement ever needed in a void function since no value is returned? So the answer is yes. Okay. Why yes? Because actually it still has a purpose. No? There will be times that you might encounter an error if you keep on executing the statements inside your void function. So later on we will see an example on how it happens. Okay. So the question is, what if a branch of an if-else statement requires that the function ends to avoid producing more output or creating a mathematical error? So for example, what if a division by zero occurs, such as this one? Okay, so let me show an example. So let's say going back to this example, so let's do this one. Okay, so for example, I'm going to comment this one. Okay, so which means our void function no longer has a return statement. So as you see a while ago, this is actually optional. So if I comment this one, so this will be ignored. And let's run this. So we can expect that our code would still work. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so as you can see, our code is still running because this return statement is actually optional. Okay, so you can actually choose to exclude that. Now the question is, what if, okay, uh, I will provide an invalid input. So let's say this one. Okay, I am going to provide an invalid value for this. Okay, so let's say during our function call, I will provide 0. So let's see what happens. Okay, so as you can see here, okay, we have actually an incorrect output. Okay, so what I mean with this is that supposedly an input of 0 should be captured, because if we will take a look here in our code, okay, if we will apply the same scenario to our example, so this is what's going to happen. So let's take a look here at our functions. So what if I provided an input of 0? So as you have seen a while ago, it produced a negative output, right? So for example, okay, so what if I'm going to apply the same scenario of providing uh, 0 as an input? So as you have seen, it produced an erroneous input. So instead of proceeding with our function execution and produce a wrong output, So why not capture such error by using a return statement such as this one? Okay. So if I'm going to put this, okay, just like in our example here, such as this one, okay, although this one is a different function, but we will apply the same logic, okay, in our example here. So let's see what's going to happen. Okay, again, I'm going to provide 0. So as you can see there, okay, the function did not proceed with the rest of the statements because it was able to capture our output here. Okay, so as you can see here, this is actually quite a useful scenario in which we can actually use the return statement for a good purpose. Although it is optional, but in this case, we chose to use the return statement to capture a possible logic error. Okay, next. So how about for the main function? So the main function is in a program is used like a void function. So do you have to end the program with a return statement? So because the main function is defined to return a value of type int, the return is needed. Okay, so as you have seen in our example. And of course, as the standard says, the return 0 can be omitted, but many compilers still require it. Okay, so that concludes the first topic for this chapter. So in this at this point, so you're expected that you can now describe the differences between void functions and functions that return one value. And also, we now know what would happen if we forgot the return statement in a void function. Although it is optional, but of course, it is also useful, and I think it's also a good practice if we make it a habit to always put a return statement in our functions, even though if they don't return anything.